Brilliant. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dixon. Thank you all for coming to this. Thank you to the WYNG Foundation for letting me use this space and do this talk. Yeah, I'm Tom. I've been interning at Parks and Trails for just 2.5 weeks now, but sadly in 3 days I'll be gone. And I'm going to be presenting on sea change, how the uses and perceptions of Hong Kong Island's coastline have shifted over time. So first of all, a little bit about me. I have lived in the UK my whole life, but this is actually my second time visiting Hong Kong. I came on a choir tour when I was a child back in 2019, but it's been lovely to get to spend a little bit longer here this time. I've just finished a psychology undergraduate degree at Cambridge, and then next year I'm off to do a master's in urban design up in Manchester. And yeah, I've been interning with Parks and Trails, which has been a real pleasure. So thank you all for making that wonderful. This talk is basically split into two halves. The first half is focused much more closely on that topic question on the previous slide, looking at the historical changes to the approach to the coastline on Hong Kong Island and how the Coastal Trail and the Coastal Trail Challenge fit into that latterly in the talk. And then part two is a lot more discursive. I encourage you all to contribute and ask questions and add comments. And I've also pre-prepared a bunch more slides that are a little bit more talkative and light-hearted that don't fit into the main narrative if people want to see those. And those are largely in response to questions that you guys submitted when you were signing up to attend this talk. So cool. To understand Hong Kong's waterfront today, I think you have to understand its changing role from at least the start of colonial rule. So there was basically an immediate shift on how the population of Hong Kong approached its coastline and how the newly formed colonial leadership approached the water and coastline of the island on the start of British rule. So in 1842, at the start, there was around 7,500 people on Hong Kong Island. Around 2,000 of those were tanker boat people, and they had this dependence on the coast both as a place of habitation and also a place of subsistence. And this was reflected in where the major settlements were at the time. So Shek-Chi, which was Stanley, was the largest settlement on the island at that point. And that was for various reasons, but mostly due to slightly shallower waters, easier fishing territory. Immediately on being colonised by the British, the major's focus of development switched to the north coast of the island in Victoria Harbour. And that was because the waters of the harbour were a lot deeper and allowed for merchant vessels to traverse that waterway and begin the development of Hong Kong into an entrepot for the re-export of goods internationally from and going to this part of the globe. And so the ocean changes its perception as this place of subsistence and habitation to actually an economic forefront and a place of opportunity. And very quickly in 1841, land auctions began to sell the land in Victoria Harbour off to developers to build wharves and piers and warehouses on that waterfront. And the British had a number of different methods for instigating control over the littoral space, the water space, at this time. So and this was done to try and control the kind of existing transient littoral space where boat dwelling communities were neither particularly influenced by the Qing dynasty on the mainland nor by British ships in the waters. And so detailed requirements on what watercraft had to have were slowly instituted. Necessity for permits, licenses, ships had to display lights overnight so they were identifiable, restrictions on mooring times and locations started to be instituted. These were enforced in a number of ways. The harbour masters' offices were established around the island in places like Shau Kei Wan, Shek Chu, now Stanley, and Shei Pai Wan, now Aberdeen. And there were water police that would go around on boats to actually enforce day-to-day stuff. There were legal changes as well. The Amphibious Laws Ordinance of 1887 put regulations on brothels and prostitution in the water, and also there were increasingly strict designations about which sections of the harbour could be used by which vessels, especially after steamships became more common, because there was, and these had very little regard for the natural features of the harbour landscape and instead were based on kind of administrative concerns. Then there was more racially astute control methods like the Ordinance for the Better Regulation and Control of Certain Vessels Frequenting the Waters of Hong Kong, wording, which was instituted in 1866, which defined junk vessels, which at the time were, it was a pretty catch-all term used by the British. It's now slightly better understood, but to define any kind of East Asian seafaring vessel. This ordinance determined where these ships were allowed to moor. These mooring places, while of course this ordinance kind of put it under the guise of it was vessel type, the ordinance also referred to these mooring places as Tang Chuan Wanbo, and Tang at the time was a term that was used to describe ethnically Chinese people, and so that kind of plausible deniability of using the vessel type to determine where things could moor pretty quickly falls away in favour of actually this is a tool of racial segmentation. Some of these methods seem to work. By 1891, 40,000 merchant vessels were recorded using the harbour. It was one of the biggest ports in the world in terms of through traffic at that point. Reclamation was another tool used by the British to instigate control. Nowadays, 6% of Hong Kong's land, that's 70 kilometres squared, is reclaimed. 25% of the developed land in the territory is built on reclaimed land, and reclaimed land houses 1/3 of the population, although only 1/5 of reclaimed land is actually accessible to the public across the whole territory. And this started from very early on, so from the initial construction of Hollywood Road, Queens Road and Wyndham Street back in 1841, the rubble from that was poured into the harbour, which created those plots which were then sold off. And then quickly afterwards, in 1855, was proposed the Prior Reclamation Scheme, much to the chagrin of the existing waterfront landowners that their land was about to become landlocked. Which was finished in 1967, and it was conceived for a number of purposes, one of which was to improve the kind of world-facing frontage of Hong Kong, make it more attractive, but that in itself was a way of imposing colonial control and a display of kind of power in the region. But there were other motivations for example, putting a public access roadway along the front, which blocked off a potential escape route for dissidents via the water, going straight from private residences out into the harbour. Now they would have to pass through public space. And similarly, this development of public space allowed the colonial authorities at the time to kind of start to define kind of a moral consensus around what activities were acceptable in public, because they had this easily policeable frontage on the water. The Prior Reclamation Office, which there were subsequent reclamation schemes all along the waterfront, as I'm sure you know, was established in 1891 and added state legitimacy to this governmental use of the harbour as a kind of economic productive space where new land could be created and then sold for profit. But the realities of these control attempts were different. The practicalities of enforcing the laws that the colonial authorities were trying to put in place was difficult. There were many conflict points in usage. Pedder's Wharf there was repeatedly complained about by everyone seemingly because it was too busy and too small, until it was eventually replaced with redoing a couple of different piers and wharves and the construction of a new one. And coordination communication between the harbour master's offices and the water police was actually very difficult. Obviously, limited communications technologies at the time, and pace of those actions was challenging. There were even disputes. Oh, actually, no, I've got something else to say first. There was a massive increase in breach of harbour regulations across the latter part of the 19th century, with, as you can see, from 64 breaches in the year 1876 to 670 in 1897. A lot of those were things like not leaving lights on at night. But there are even disputes in water usage by within different levels of British control. So the colonial authorities set up a lazaretto on Stonecutters Island to try and stave off the spread of cholera. But actually, a few years later, the British military decided to build a barracks on the island and basically kick them off. So there were many conflict points in and around the water. And there was, continued piracy within floating communities. Supposedly, piracy decreased on record from 1967 after that junk ordinance, 1867 probably. But actually, this is likely more a symptom of reluctance by indigenous populations to report piracy when it was happening, because they knew that the British authorities were unlikely to actually prosecute it. And similarly, the authorities were supposed to be doing spot checks on the boats entering the junk harbours, but the realities of actually the amount of through traffic meant that that's very unrealistic to have been happening. One harbour master in Stanley reported the arrival of 300 boats one night, which all departed the next morning. It's difficult to believe that all of those would have been surveyed for piracy. So skipping ahead in time a little bit, there was major demographic and industrial shift, as I'm sure you all know, following the Chinese Civil War in Hong Kong, with the arrival of both many migrant workers coming from the mainland, but also capitalist factory owners who were bringing their technology into the mainland. And this led to a rapid expansion of factory space and public housing across the territory. And this began this shift from being purely an entrepôt to being a manufacturing hub. The Abercrombie Report in 1948, also known as Hong Kong Preliminary Planning Report, set out broad principles for Hong Kong's upcoming development. The harbour was defined as in this planning report as a site for development of both export of industrial and imported goods in the future. A lot of this development took place in around, for example, North Point, where there was already a power station, but also in less developed and more peripheral areas of the colony, where there was more space for these early developments and less regard perhaps for local population's interests. So places like Chai Wan and Wong Chuk Hang were developed rapidly with little regard for the heritage or ecology of these environments. This accelerated after the Shek Kip Mei fire of 1953, which was burning of a massive shantytown of 53,000 Chinese immigrants, all of whom then needed rehousing. And so the construction of these INH-shaped rapid modernist housing blocks began across the island. The only remaining one of these was actually a small unit factory building, which is now the Wahao estate, was the Chai Wan factory estate, built in 1959. A really interesting redevelopment project, quite close to, well, then very close to the coast, separated only by like a scout ground and a typhoon shelter, and now quite a long way from the coast. In fact, 100 acres of the Chai Wan coastline has been reclaimed almost entirely for industry at the time, since then. And this has cut off local residents, obviously, from access to that coastline in favour of industrial interests, with kind of little regard, especially in the early days, for any sort of heritage or ecological preservation. You can still see the kind of cultural impacts of these in very industrial parts of the island in like shop opening times. I saw mentioned online a place called Chat Key in Chai Wan, very close to the Chai Wan factory estate, which opens at 6 a.m. every morning as a vestige of when the workers would need food going in for their early shifts. And you've got this conflict between the incentives that exist for land reclamation for the government versus the costs of decreasing that access. So land sales are very lucrative for the government, and industry was booming and demanding more land for development. Meanwhile, public demand for the shoreline was limited. We'll talk about hierarchies of access in a moment and the ability people had to actually advocate for themselves in this case. And the construction of these factories, especially in places like Chai Wan, limited horizontal, vertical, and visual access, or horizontal access, its ability to travel along the shoreline. Vertical means getting to shoreline to travel along it, and visual access is obviously being able to actually see water and the benefits associated with that. And there is in Hong Kong, as in the UK, kind of understood legal provision for traversing the intertidal zone. Like that's an understood thing that people have the right to do. But on seawalls, on reclaimed land, there is no intertidal zone to traverse. It is a flat wall. So that is another limiting part of these reclamation schemes. At the same time as this, the Abercrombie report also suggested that Victoria Harbour and the Peak and the southern beaches were ripe for tourist development. And the report barely mentions at all any kind of provision for public space on waterfronts. But this wasn't shared by all members of the government at the time. In 1956, Brooke Bernecki proposed the development of a promenade in Gloucester Road in Wanchai to the council, saying, if this waterfront is converted into a promenade, then it will provide an open space for a very large number of people to use, and I'm sure would be of the greatest service to our community, to say nothing of beautifying what is at present a rather ugly stretch of waterfront, which is also the first real stretch of city waterfront seen by persons arriving in the colony for the first time. Although I mention this beautifying aspect, I do more particularly stress the importance of a promenade along this waterfront to the very large number of people living in the crowded tenements of Wanchai district. So this received quite significant support among the council, and it's interesting that like the main focus is actually improving the lives of the citizens of Wanchai. Places like the False Bay had actually, although they were mentioned in the Abercrombie report, had actually been popular tourist destinations for quite a long time by this point, dating back to like the 1920s, with the Repulse Bay Hotel, playing places like Ernest Hemingway and Marlon Brando, and all these big names internationally. And actually, it was in some ways a kind of preferentially treated environment already, partially a constructed beach, artificial beach. And it still to this day has one of the longest continuously running bus routes from Central to Repulse Bay on the island that exists. One of the oldest running bus routes that has run since the 1920s. I think it's the sixth hex. So we get this picture of Hong Kong Island as a very contrasting in its coastal provision and access to the coast. For different people, you know, the affluent touristic areas of the island got these development schemes and access, and got the tourists got their kind of frontage that the world could see of Hong Kong, while different parts of the island did not. Rural areas left broadly unintegrated into transport networks, and industrial areas with their like large immigrant populations greatly under-provisioned. And also these immigrant populations don't have the same latent knowledge of local coastal access routes that are unmarked, and so they are limited in that way as well. Just for reference, that is what Gloucester Road is looking like today, so not sure that lasted. So yeah, taking a little step back, we've got obviously Central and Wanchai there, we've got North Point up top, we've got Chai Wan, Wong Chuk Kung, Hang, and Repulse Bay there. And we've got these major discrepancies in provision across the island, and these are mediated by both social systems and spatial geography. Right. And that is referred to generally as differences in hierarchies of access. So we have, in Wanchai, we've got like social barriers. Obviously it was constructed to support the very dense tenement buildings that existed there at the time, but individual people in that community may not have had the time or the means to actually make use of those waterfront promenades, and whether or not they even feel welcome in the increasingly gentrifying Central Harbour section like that is again another question. And in Chai Wan you've got social and spatial barriers. They're actually quite distant from the nicely developed parts of the island, but also you've got these same social barriers that exist across the island. And while like the benefits of kind of economic productivity from tourism and from presenting a handsome face to the world are appreciated by the council, everyone was also aware at the time of, for example, health benefits. You know, the tourists who were travelling appreciated that spending some time by the coast did you some good, getting some fresh air, and this was similarly understood by officials. There were also social benefits that were going kind of unreaped by the lack of coastal access. You know, community engagement is easy when you've got these open spaces that can be shared by many. Teaching and learning, pedagogy is more possible in these spaces, and especially engagement with the nature around you, which something we'll get on to talking more about later. And pro-social behaviour from sharing in this public good and caring for that as a community. But the Central Harbour, of course, did not retain the initial stated goals of being a local public space, with major changes in the latter quarter of the 20th century as the shift from kind of light industry driving the Hong Kong economy towards banking and services. And we see this in the buildings along the harbour. It's very obvious. We've got these massive modernist kind of anonymous buildings, overtly business oriented and very proud of it and displaying that with the lights down onto that kind of central and Wan Chai waterfront promenade. One paper I read described them as corporate megastructures, which I found an interesting description. And simultaneous to this development, just off the coastline, you have the increasing touristification of the waterfront itself, with kind of it being such a definitive symbol of Hong Kong. That harbour frontage is the place that everyone wants to visit. You end up constructing kind of sheltered, convenient space for visitors to enjoy, but it doesn't really offer services for local people, and indeed those local people are being pushed further and further away by the corporate developments. You have things like the what's it called, the wheel, the viewing thing, and the exhibition centre on the IFC as well. Yeah, these major developments that kind of mostly serve touristic interests. And so the public realm is both being squashed from both sides then, and also being invaded. Like, you're literally being overlooked, you're being bombarded with commercial interests on that section of waterfront. I think this is typified nicely by if you walk along the waterfront, you notice a sudden density of the Hong Kong Asia's World City branding, which is not, that is branding for international visitors. That doesn't exist for anybody else, and that is absent conspicuously from other sections of the waterfront. A lot of people putting funny faces in the audience. But this is not the whole story. Perspectives have been changing both from public advocacy point of view and then subsequently from policy and government action point of view on the approach to the waterfront. And these changes are reflected in the coastal trail, as I will come on to talk about. The harbour now is about half as wide as it was in 1842, and adjacent land remains some of the most expensive land in the world. The impetus for the authorities to reclaim land, sell it, promote growth, gain the revenue from them is as high as it ever was, if not higher. So why is this not happening at an increased rate, at least in the harbour? Well, in 1995, I don't think it's Paul Zimmerman, you all know, has been very involved in parts of this. But yeah, the Society for the Protection of the Harbour was founded, and they proposed the Protection of the Harbour Ordinance, and received 170,000 signatures, and that was eventually passed in 1997. And this stated the harbour is to be protected and preserved as a special public asset, natural heritage of Hong Kong people, and for that purpose there should be a presumption against reclamation in the harbour. And this was backed up subsequently in 2003, which has fallen out of my notes annoyingly, but I will say it as I remember it, by the High Court, when there were challenges to the Phase 3 Central Reclamation Plan, and the High Court defined this as requiring a compelling overriding and present need for reclamation in the harbour, that there be no viable alternative, and that the minimum impairment possible to the harbour be instituted. And if all of those things are met, then you can do a reclamation scheme. And there was one, and it was the Phase 3 Central Reclamation Plan, but there have been very, very few harbourfront reclamation schemes since then. But there's also concerns, there are other reasons for this, concerns as well as for the cultural and natural heritage of the harbour, also for the harbour's ability to self-clean. As the channel narrows, the flow of water actually decreases, and so the kind of balance of self-cleaning waterway in the ocean gets more difficult, which will decrease the cooling, positive effects of the adjacent urban areas of that harbour waterfront, and also ability to support wildlife. Ecological concerns have now extended well beyond the limits of the harbour reclamation and just loss of that land. The third runway at Check Lap Cock airport faced significant backlash, as I'm sure you all know, in the interests of preserving the Chinese white dolphin. There was only 2,500 left of them in the entire polar river delta, according to the WWF, and that has been observed to continue to decrease at a rapid rate subsequent to that expansion when it was recently finished. And there's a kind of deeper problem with the nature of reclamation schemes and the waterfront and how that relates to ecology. Reclaimed waterfronts are simply not complex enough to support complex habitats and high levels of biodiversity. The number of habitat niches that exist in the natural coastline is leagues higher than on a flat seawall. See, that isn't a flat seawall. So there have been a number of very successful pilot schemes across Hong Kong to institute eco-shorelines and integrate grey engineering strategies that obviously have to exist in these urban environments, like breakwaters and seawalls, with more ecological principles that promote biodiversity and habitat creation. So, for example, at Tung Chung East, obviously that isn't on Hong Kong Island, Newtown Extension, they used eco-tiles and artificial rock pools and oyster seeding back in 2016, and that was very successful. You can see image of that there. And through coordination of a lot of different interest groups, so that's academics, policymakers, engineers, construction workers, all collaborating, they managed to create the Hong Kong Nature-Based Solutions Design Guidelines, which sounds very boring, but is obviously very significant in actually integrating ecological concerns and nature into the design process when we're talking about new developments across the territories. And this has been instituted as well on Hong Kong Island, so in Causeway Bay and Wan Chai, seawalls have been retrofitted with eco-tiles to provide this extra level of complexity, and oysters and oyster rafts have been found to be very successful and economically efficient ways of cleaning like harbour areas that receive less water ventilation. So, for example, typhoon shelters can be very effectively cleaned by oyster seeding and installing oyster rafts. And there are social benefits to this, as I touched on earlier. The visibility and accessibility of vibrant marine environments and organisms can facilitate community-led and family-led education schemes, can be used in schools and by families as part of an engagement with nature. But obviously, if there is no wildlife and you're living in a depleted nature environment, that isn't possible. This concept, multi-species conviviality, refers both to the integration of natural concerns into the planning process and kind of letting those requirements of nature be at the table, but also refers to people's individual interactions with nature and facilitating those and making those as comfortable and meaningful for both sides of that coin as possible. And similarly, there have been changing perspectives around heritage, and I think one of the major ways that this has been expressed is in the deep integration of heritage into waterfront regeneration projects. So, for example, the pier demolitions for this phase 3 reclamation construction of Edinburgh Place Pier, or the Star Ferry Pier, back in 2006, and the Queen's Pier in 2007, received massive expressions of public opinion and protest, and even people going on a hunger strike to try and protest those. Obviously, they did go ahead, but this demonstrated the strength of public opinion around preserving the built heritage of Hong Kong and the waterfront. And I think that there's been a lot of use of kind of demonstration of heritage and education through these regeneration schemes. The regenerated waterfronts in basically every urban area around the island have kind of blown me away. I think they're very, very enviable. And the mixed use and well-used nature of them is pretty fantastic. For example, the work that the Harbourfront Commission has done to create this kind of 15-kilometre, basically continuous Victoria Harbour promenade with their flagship North Point developments to undo some of the poorer planning decisions of the latter half of the 20th century, such as the Island Eastern Corridor. And that's continuing, as I understand it, with a redevelopment of the Kennedy Town waterfront starting in 2028. And there's lots of ways that the historical information and historical informed design has taken place in these. So, for example, here in Outreach Bay, we have this what looked to be a very new information sign, and similarly in like the Invigorating Island South scheme, I saw a lot of this. So they've got themed areas along the waterfront, and some of those are themed around like the dragon boat races, and there were placards all the way along that I was enjoying reading, and I was noticing locals kind of getting up from benches and coming and enjoying reading as well along that front. And also they had this rather nice, it's a shoddy photo, but like heritage photo gallery on the waterfront as well, with lots of kind of old records of Aberdeen Harbour of past. And yeah, I've just in general been very impressed by the integration of this into all of the other uses of these waterfronts. Sport and exercise, and the exercise machines that are included there, jogging, performance venues. I've seen wheelchair accessible ramps being used, pet-friendly spaces. I really enjoyed the pet food vending machine that I found in North Point. Boardwalk. What else? Yeah, shelters from the rain, and most of them have very little commercial intrusion. There is some criticism of the approach of these waterfront generation schemes to heritage, which is that they kind of bypass them. This was something mentioned in one of the Parks and Trails newsletters, actually, that the North Point scheme, as it kind of shoots under the Eastern Bypass, actually just skips out all of the real industrial heritage of North Point. But I think that like increasing accessibility and to that waterfront is unlikely to be doing harm, at the very least, to heritage. So finally, the Coastal Trail, and why I think it exemplifies and indeed enhances these positive changes that have been happening around the coastline. The Coastal Trail has like an inherent bias towards local use rather than tourist use because it is a longer distance trail and requires therefore a certain time premium to complete in its entirety, or kind of level of preparation that would be under-expected perhaps from your average tourist. And therefore it is a resource that primarily benefits local people. But that doesn't mean that it isn't also to the benefit of tourists. Obviously, the more intrepid visitor to the island gets to benefit from all of this stuff as well, and all of these new waterfront developments, and getting a better sense of the island as a whole, which is something that I think is also gained from a local perspective. A sense of place and embeddedness in the island is gained from circumnavigation. I've nearly finished it. I wanted to finish the whole thing before this talk. I unfortunately haven't done the section just from Stanley around to the Dragon's Back, but I'll be doing that over the next few days before I leave. And it's really valuable, I think, to get a sense of scale and a sense of perspective on the whole island. It's a very unique way of experiencing Hong Kong Island, especially if people spend a lot of their time travelling via the MTR or even other public transport. You start to lose track of quite how the whole place fits together and what the scale actually is. It's really significant, I think, that the government has adopted the scheme into the Round the Island Trail as well, after years of advocacy work by many people in this room, because that represents a kind of alignment, perhaps, of public access, heritage, and ecology interests with governmental private access, heritage, and ecology interests. And that is likely to keep happening as Hong Kong Island kind of pushes the limits of developability, both in terms of what land can be developed and also like how quality of life can be improved for people, and how it can become a more developed space in a more holistic sense. And obviously it improves local and horizontal access to the coast in a lot of ways. Yes, the challenge as well, the Coastal Trail Challenge, is a really wonderful furthering of this in the way that it is integrating community and socializing into what can sometimes be quite a isolated activity such as hiking, and both provisions for beginners and those who are less physically able, those who might have children, with the what's it called, the what do you call it, the leisure one version of the CTC? Leisure, yeah. The leisure imagination, okay. and the actual race for the more experienced and bold, experienced trail runners. And just for some final thoughts from this first section of the talk, I'm conscious that the coastal trail, as wonderful as it is, might represent some slightly unpleasant things, and I think it's worth engaging with those. So the central harbour front remains an over-touristified place. You feel it as you walk along. The number of people using it for day-to-day welfare and leisure activities decreases. You start to notice that the only people using it for sport are running through the central harbour front, whereas you get a lot more people doing static exercises, for example, and the more peripheral sections of the Victoria Harbour. And I think that's because it remains a space that is not really well provisioned for day-to-day recreational use. It is very kind of intruded upon by commercial interests. And actually, the promotion and the increased connectivity in peripheral areas of the island's coastline does in some ways constitute giving up on the central harbour front for local people. You can get all the way around without ever having to pass through it now, and in some ways that is a shame. I put the duckling, I spelled it too correctly. There's no C, which is the name of the sampan that still sails in the harbour, and that's kind of typifying, I think, the slight parody of itself that the Central Harbour has become. Because while this is a historic sampan, it has a diesel engine and is only used for tourist tours. This is a photo opportunity, and that's it. What I've written in my notes here is that it is such an iconic part of Hong Kong that in some ways it has become separated from the rest of the city. So that's something to think about. And the other thing is that while Hong Kong Island has mostly lost a lot of its industrial, modern industrial usage, that has still gone elsewhere. The other parts of the SAR do not have quite as complete coastal trails as Hong Kong Island does, and so there has to be an offloading of these necessary functions to other parts. Do I think that's something that is a negative to the coastal trail? No, not really. And it's wonderful that you would have that complete trail around the kind of most historic core of the city, but those considerations cannot be neglected. Thank you very much. So, I open the floor, contribute things, give me feedback. I prepared a bunch of slides on my personal thoughts and responses to the trail. You've got some of that there. Some issues I have with signage on the trail, which may constitute a kind of comedy rant, because I think it's funny. And then a load of international comparisons and what you may or may not learn from those. So thank you very much. Any questions from the start? The things that, hello.
Thank you, Tom, so much for this presentation. I just written down the question. You mentioned that the NDS is incorporated to preserve the ecology during the waterfront redevelopment. From your perspective, what are some of the measures or any global examples as reference to balance the ecology, economic development, and heritage conservation?
To balance what, sorry?
Do you have any global examples? How can we take it as reference in terms of the redevelopment of the waterfront?
Yeah, I mean, because when the harbour waterfront is such a built-up area, and it's very difficult to meaningfully you can't rewild, for example, that it's not a feasible thing to do. As we talked about these schemes where you are retrofitting artificial habitats and complexity onto seawalls is a really good start. And especially when you integrate oyster seeding into that as well, that seems to have significant effects on biodiversity. There's always a conflict between trail usage and the damage done to that trail. So there's an example here that I've got from a really good paper that you can't actually read. It's Leary et al. 2026 from southern Sweden, in a place called Scania, which is this Kalla trail, which they defined the trail. It's about 70 kilometers long, and while that trail has like undergone significantly more foot erosion and you know is much more degraded as an environment, actually there is an improvement there from the previous situation, which was like many different paths because it was a defined people going in lots of different directions, and you end up with this kind of web of desire lines across the landscape. So I think that like defining the specific route that people are going to be taking around Hong Kong Island, if they want to, you know, circumnavigate it, is a good start in terms of like leaving more environments undisturbed by tourist intrusion, essentially. One of the things that I wanted to talk about, but I didn't end up like really integrating into the talk, was like defining this route does that. It means that people are less likely to trespass. It means that people are less likely to accidentally damage landscapes or buildings or trying to access sections of coastline, because you've almost got a kind of defensible route around the island. The flip side of that, of course, is, especially as it comes under governmental oversight, that actually there are large parts of the trail that still are a little way inland, and any future claims to want to make accessible those parts of waterfront become more difficult to make when you've already defined a like circular coastal route that doesn't require them. That's a bit off-piste, but sort of tangentially related to your question. In terms of other natural heritage schemes, I mean, in actual fact, as I say, these eco-shoreline schemes were pretty pioneering, and they are continuing to this day in Hong Kong. Like, this has been the place where this research has been being done and being integrated into policy. So, you're doing the right things. Lovely. Cool. If anyone has more questions, just pitch in and comments and things. I thought it might be interesting to just like talk about my experience with the trail, and then show you some international comparisons, some more the one you just saw. So I was a bit, as I've said, I've been like consistently kind of amazed by the quality of your waterfront spaces, especially in the urban areas, and just the amount that they are being used and the amount of different stuff they're being used for. I've seen jogging, I've seen cycling, I've seen dog walking, I've seen video content creation, I've seen different forms of exercise, I've seen fishing, I've seen boating, I've seen like children playing in like artificial paddling pools and things. There is so much, and it is so impressive. And it's been a real joy doing a lot of my walking at like kind of after work time or just the end of work time, because there's just been people using them, and they've been loads of people, and it's been a real delight. And I haven't spent that much time in like waterfront cities in the UK, but I'd be very surprised if that level of service provision and also usage is recreated anywhere other than like London. So that's been a real delight. And that's true also of the more remote sections of the track. I thought have been shockingly well maintained and really fun to explore and very easy to get to. And obviously, like, you guys have the best public transport in the world, and I've really enjoyed using that. That's been a real delight, coming from Cambridge with the worst buses ever. What else? Yeah, and I've also really enjoyed the urban sections. I've taken lots of photos on this trip, and I always do like urban walking, but I think the urban environment in Hong Kong is particularly interesting and visually stimulating. I think the kind of complexity of the changing perspectives you have on just like the amount of towers and then, you know, hills behind is particularly fun to explore. I had some problems. I this road, for example, in Aberdeen, I thought, is this actually right? This doesn't look like part of the trail. And it was, it's both nice and interesting to see kind of the backside of these industrial warehouses, especially because this is sandwiched by like really lovely harbourfront walking in Aberdeen. But I was like, is this actually correct? And similarly over there in Chaiwan, I ended up wandering into an estate because I couldn't quite figure out the route and getting trapped there for a bit, which was nice.
It's a footbridge hell over there.
Yeah, it's a lot, and then just like small sections of poor maintenance that I've now alerted to Dixon, but I'm told also that's an old version of the route. I was going off the route on Trail Watch, so I'm sure changes are happening, especially for the challenge this year. My major gripe, if you will indulge me for a few short minutes, is signage. It's been really interesting the level of provision that exists on the waterfronts, given the complexity of governance. I've seen so many different signs by so many different people and so many different institutions claiming responsibility, at least in part, for the trail. I've seen signs by the Southern District Coastal Trail, set up by the Southern District Council. I think that was Paul Zimmerman behind it. There's no reference to this trail anywhere online. This doesn't exist. This has been wiped from the internet. And then Island South claiming ownership of like sections and mentioning the Round the Island Trail on its website. Round the Island Trail signs, there's like a handful, so few of them. Sorry, the photos are so dark, I didn't get a chance to brighten them up. What else? Any sections in national parks have signs with the logos of the Agricultural, Fisheries and Conservation Department on them. Any beaches and also sections of the West Harbour have the Leisure and Cultural Services Department logo plastered all over them. And then you've got Victoria Harbourfront and the Harbourfront Commission with all of their signage along their sections. And it's kind of pretty baffling, actually. And you don't get a sense really at any point that there is a continuous loop that you should be following. Obviously, it's like not, the Round the Island Trail is not completely finished yet, but still, that's what we follow. More signage. I really enjoyed the accounts of Bloomy the Tree, a mascot for a 300-metre section of promenade on just Cadogan Street, who turns up to tell me to not smoke, not fish, and not climb or access the piers. I really enjoyed this, which was two separate institutions. This is the Leisure and Cultural Services Department in Victoria Harbour, providing the same information on two signs directly next to each other. And then I enjoyed this thing as well. There's lots of funky installations that the Harbourfront Commission have done. We'll get onto another one of those in a second. But this one is like a kind of weird, it's like pretends to be a map, because obviously the logo's kind of the shape of the harbourfront, and it's got like distances listed to different places, but it's also got like these bits that I don't know what these are, and it says you can't climb on them. What else are you going to do with them? There's nothing else to do with this. This is a climbing frame. Next up, we have the winner of the confusing signage competition is Shingsai Road, which is a single 650-metre section of road that runs between, is it like Belcher Bay and part of the West Central promenade. And it has more signage on it than the whole rest of the trail combined. The density of signs and like inspirational messages that exist on this is completely fascinating to me. I haven't included, there's lots of signs that just say run, which is terrifying. This really freaked me out. And this is all like completely new. One of these is broken already, even though it's not visible on Street View from November last year. So most of this hasn't existed more than like 6 months, and yet one of these signs is already damaged. But like, it's not damaged in a way that a car could have hit it, because a car couldn't have hit it. It's on the edge of just the Ding Ding route. So I don't know what could have possibly damaged it. And also, the most frustrating part about this is there are these signs pointing into the two places you could be going for the whole thing. The issue with that being that there is no turnings off this road. So there's no like possibility that anyone is going to be getting lost on this section of path. And these things, what are these? These things look like benches / like rain shelters. except they're not near anything that would be useful to be sheltered from the rain, and the benches are slanting, so you can't really sit on them, and the roofs are slanting, so they don't really offer any shelter, and they've got arrows that point in direction. I'd like to point out that this one is here, 55 metres away from this one, which is here. So you follow these arrows to go this way, and then you immediately reach these arrows and have to go back again, and then you get stuck. As it turns out, they're run by the Harbourfront Commission. The only indication that that is the case is the tiny little Harbourfront logo without words. It doesn't say Harbourfront route. It doesn't say, there's no like text on this at all. So these really intrigued me. The point of, sorry, measured response over. The point being that like, I will use the example of the King Charles III coast path in England. Which was it's opened in March this year. It's a similar thing by connecting up previously existing sections of coastline that have had these paths provisioned for them in the UK. It's going to be the longest in the world when it's completed. It's not fully complete yet, and it also joins up with the Wales coast path, so you can do a complete loop. There's also a national trail, I can talk about in a second, that cuts off Wales there, and. This is a wonderful scheme. Obviously, it's doing very, very different things to the Hong Kong Island Coastal Trail. It would take like 5 or 6 months to walk the whole thing because it is very long, and like also there are large path networks in Scotland that you could connect, and that would take even longer. But it does, and this is something that the UK does very well, is like small, non-invasive signage. These are maybe like yay big, and you'll find them on posts all across the country with like the name of the trail and your next direction. I'm not going to go so far as to say that like you could walk this entire 2,500 mile coast path without a map, but you could do a pretty good job, and you definitely wouldn't need a route map because you could always like find your way based on these for the most part. And I think that's something I'd really commend, because also, if you live close to the coast in the UK and you see one of those, you immediately think, oh cool, there's a coast path that runs near me and runs, you know, as long as I want in either direction, and then you can start deciding to do sections of it that are near you, for example. And it's a kind of really easy passive communication tool that this route exists around the country. And I know that that is the case, because I live on a national trail in the UK. I live about there on the Thames Path, which also has these signs, and I have walked long sections of the Thames Path, and that's been really charming. Other national trails in the UK have a slightly different role. A lot of them are not very urban. Perhaps the most urban is actually the Thames Path, because it ends in London and you go right through the centre of London if you're walking on it. You start at the source up in the Cotswolds, which you might have heard of, and then wind your way down. But other trails of kind of similar length, up in Scotland there's the West Highland Way, very famous, very old trail, running from the edge of Glasgow in a place called Mulgai, which is spelt Milngavie because the Scottish hate language, and it runs up to Fort William up in the Highlands, which is something I did a few years ago. And perhaps a very comparable UK example is the Greater Manchester Ringway, because that does actually go right round a large city and does a similar thing of trying to integrate heritage and the natural environment and the natural resources that are close to Greater Manchester. So you get up into the Peak District, which is a national park over here, or up into the North Pennines, which is a national scenic area. And yeah, you pass through lots of interesting old industrial heritage and older. Lyme Country House is much older, but obviously these canals date back from like the early days of the Industrial Revolution. So yeah, kind of similar focus and interests as a scheme to the Hong Kong Island Coastal Trail. And then we have like perhaps the closest analogous scheme is this route around Singapore called the Round Island route, which is about half complete, but like the route that the phase 2 route is known, it just hasn't been kind of designated and all the works haven't been done yet, but people do complete it. And this is both a walking and cycling route, and it seems to be more popular, I think, as a cycling route, I guess because of its slightly longer length. And this is integrated into their green plan, which is all about kind of getting Singaporeans more active and spending more time in nature and healthier and this kind of stuff. So yeah, it's a facet of that. I think it's a pillar of that. But it's not very much focused on heritage, very little in fact. So that's one of the big differences between the Hong Kong Island Trail and this one is kind of engagement or primacy given to heritage as part of it.
I was just wondering, in your research, like, did you look at how different cities in the world deal with temporary land uses while they are putting together one of these trails? And as you know, we have a whole bunch of temporary stuff that's still on in Central, like the observation wheel is technically like temporary, it's on a 5-year lease or something. There's a bunch of temporary event space. There's like a huge construction site still there. There's chunks that are gonna get ripped up for like an MTR or like thing infrastructure we forgot to put in the first place, and they have to go back and dig another big hole. So like it's gonna be a big construction site for like probably the next 20 years in various places.
Yeah.
And then like when there's like construction going on, like what do you do? Like are there any temporary measures that you can do to ameliorate it and still have it to be functional? And have you got any good examples of how any other places have dealt with that?
The short answer is no. There is I mean, I'll speak on the UK because it's what I know best. I think the UK is typically very bad at this. There are actually legal requirements that if you intersect a, what's it called? I forget the official term, like a protected public path in the UK. And there's a very large, extensive and well-respected network of protected public paths. You have to provide an alternate route if there's construction, and that would be part of the planning proposal, will be offering up these alternative routes. So there's a big boat bypass being built near me at the moment, and there's a lot of routes that pass through that. And actually, while those temporary alternative routes have been designated, they're very shoddy. I've had bad experiences before on the Thames Path. I was doing quite an ambitiously long day, and we reached one bridge that was closed for unknown reasons, and we ended up having to do a ridiculous detour that essentially no one else had even tried to do because it didn't work. And it was like, you know, thicket overgrown hillsides and things. But yeah, so like these things are you can write the legal requirements for these things into planning legislation quite easily, but the practicalities of that are obviously very challenging. And you have this also with maintenance of these pathways, right? Like, especially if you're in hillier areas, repaving might be necessary, and trying to limit kind of spread of path erosion. Different schemes to do that can end up shutting off sections of path. I think basically there just needs to be a decent way of reporting failures to do so, or inadequate methods of doing so, and perhaps, you know, it's useful if there's quite specific regulations. And so far, you know, regulation doesn't slow down kind of everything, but like it's useful if there are specific regulations on what is expected of an alternative route. Yeah, I don't know. Do you have any good examples?
Nope, just wondering.
Yeah, it's absolutely fine. Yeah. A couple other examples then of kind of interesting international correlates. This paper, I've already put Norway and Sweden on it. It also mentions Denmark, but that's particularly in the case of coastal erosion and how that limits and compresses public space on the coast. That's not a problem in Hong Kong. You guys have the opposite problem because you're building out into, and then the rest of your coastline is rocks, so those aren't really going anywhere. But like in places with softer sediment, there's a real issue with like retreating coastlines banging into existing urban development and therefore collapsing that public space. There's also, this is in Norway, down at Oslofjord. There is no hiking route here. This is the theoretical, it's actually a cycle route that I found between Kristiansand and Oslo. And this is because basically for the land of Oslofjord there's been a lot of illegal home construction and then attempts to shut off access to the coastline is also illegal. That's been happening for just quite a long time. And this like laissez-faire attitude it's twofold. So laissez-faire attitude to policing construction of buildings and designation of private space along the coastline limits that private space, and so you'd say, well, then you should designate a specific route, and then you can kind of avoid a lot of those discussions, or at least go over their heads. But there's also a resistance to do that because it means that the overall impact is less. You get less people attempting to do a route that doesn't exist than you would doing a route that does exist. On the other hand, that means you've then got a new hierarchy of access, which is just like knowledge. And local people do who are in the know like run tours to do this route because they have the knowledge and they've spent enough time exploring this part of the world. It's quite a long way, I forget, probably about 170 miles, something like that, maybe more. But obviously people without access to paying for a paid tour route can't do it. And then we've got another similar scheme of traversing an urban island, which is the Manhattan waterfront gateway. Manhattan is a lot more built up than Hong Kong is for obvious reasons. And it's a slightly shorter route as well, and it's both for walking and cycling. It seems like a lovely thing. It's probably not that useful in comparison, even though they have superficial similarities, because it's doing a different thing. Almost all of it is on artificial waterfront. The only small section that's not is this in Woodhill Park, which is right up at the northern tip of Manhattan Island. And this is basically to give you a view of an urban jungle rather than any sections of real rural space. But yeah, it's a cool scheme nonetheless, and I think if I ever find myself back in New York, I might try and give it a go at biking. And then the only other slide that I prepared and we haven't gone through yet is I wonder whether Hong Kong Island will benefit from a designated circumnavigational cycle route. Obviously, it's not an easy cycle, there's a lot of ups and downs. I give the example of the Hebridean Way, which is an island far up north in the UK, which has two different routes, one for walking and one for cycling. I think that would be the most appropriate approach for Hong Kong to take. Obviously, you can't really have a Singapore-style same route for the whole thing, where actually they're quite different lengths, they even finish in different places. They're doing slightly different things, but they are tailored to their users. And this user on Bike Map, or whatever it's called, is that what it's called? Yeah, has come up with a route. I have no idea how viable it is. Obviously, goes to the peak, so it's quite an intense thing. But then it also becomes a route that is doable in a day to a lot more people. Obviously, you can walk the coastal trail in a day / run, but it's a pretty intense piece of exercise, whereas this would be more achievable for more people. Yeah. That's basically all I had, and we are basically out of time, but if there are any more questions, I'm very happy to do it.
I have one quick question that you can be brief. Well, thanks for your presentation and your very passionate, your passion on signage.
Yeah,
I can really feel that. I want to just quickly go back to the earlier time, the early colonial time. So a lot of the decisions of how the coastal area was developed was obviously based on economic and social consideration. I was wondering how much was those plans had security, naval concern in the coastline and design, and Is there any of those things that we can still see today?
Yeah, I mean, there's batteries all around the island. The Wan Chai has a battery. This was something I didn't really get into looking into as much as I wanted, and indeed, like, you'll notice I very conspicuously skipped over the Second World War. If I had more time, it would have been nice to look at kind of what relict evidence of Japanese occupation, for example, there was. Yeah, I mean, the waterfront, the Victoria Harbour itself, very little in actual fact. That was the most kind of well consolidated area of British influence and naval influence. And so, actually, as well, it kind of became evident to me in readings that the British Navy's ability to exert strength in the wider region was very limited, especially over the 19th century. It seemed, as I say, I haven't read very much on this, but like the reluctance to, for example, really do a proper crackdown on piracy, it actually speaks to an inability to really do a proper crackdown on piracy. So, yeah, I think I'd say not so much. Although, as we saw with the use of Stonecutter Island, the military had sway politically.
The first thing they built when they got here was the jail. So, there you go.
Yeah.
I have a quick question. Like, how, like, during your, when you're researching, like, how accessible do you find, like, was it for you to find information from those, like, the public library or the source, different public sources?
He's got better access than us. He's got academic databases, even Cambridge.
Yes, I have access to academic databases too. So, quite easy for the most part, which has been really lovely. I didn't end up using public libraries. It's more difficult, obviously, searching basically exclusively in English. I don't know what I'm missing by doing that, essentially, which is frustrating. I did try and do a bit with like translation software, but it was sort of too frustrating to be worth it given the time frame I had. There's not that much. There's surprisingly little literature, I'd say, on like the theory of waterfronts. There is some, it exists, but it's not like super deep and super developed, which in some ways is useful. Hey, we can see a battery on this. There's one. Yeah, so not too bad. Not too bad. I think if I'd have to start looking in more diverse places if I were to continue this project. Brilliant.
Okay, so thank you, Tom, for the presentation. And also, if you want to have a look at those signage or learn more about the history along the coastline, we are going to host the Hong Kong Island Coastal Trail Challenge at the end of this year. So stay tuned and you can join and see those signage and also history.